having me. Hi, I'm John Feminella. Among other things, I'm a technology leader at a company called Nuvalence, and we build intelligent platforms for modern digital businesses. Our marketing people told me to say that. You can find out more about Nuvalence at nuvalence.io, and if you care about me as an actual human being, I'm at jxf at mastodon.social, part of the Twitter exodus. And if you have a question during the talk, you can feel free to email me at my personal email, and I've got my Gmail pulled up here, so anything we don't get to, I will be happy to respond to asynchronously. And this way we can also weed out I have more of a comment than a question, things that take 20 minutes. But we're delighted to respond to anything that you have questions about. So my job is to help transform the way that enterprises build, operate, and deploy software so that their businesses are successful and more effective. But more than that, I also try to think about how the people inside of those businesses need to behave and operate if they want to be effective at managing complexity, which is part of having a modern business. So today I want to talk about how domain-driven design specifically can be a very powerful way to make people effective in these kinds of organizations. Now, that isn't a new idea, but it's one that I think is frequently misapplied or misunderstood, or in some cases just not used at all in enterprises. And so I think it's worth investing the time to understand how to do this deeply, because my experience has been that getting it right in the technology organizations I've worked with has paid enormous dividends. So at the end of our talk, I'd like to leave you with a toolkit that I think will let you be able to do those things for bringing domain-driven design into a broader audience, either within your own firm or within a broader coalition or a setting that you use to get work done. But right now, that toolkit is empty, so let's get on with the talk. So I'd like to start by talking about information. So by just a show of hands, how many of you have heard of the phrase, information wants to be free? Yep, some of you? Okay, cool. We'll say about 2/3 of the room for the sake of people watching the recording later. So when Stuart Brand said this, first in 1984 and then later in a book in 1987, he was hitting on an important idea, that information wants to be free because it's so cheap to distribute, replicate, operate on, transform it, and perform any number of operations with it. So part of the argument Brand is making here is that if it's easy to do something, that puts downward pressure on the price in terms of how much others are willing to pay for that thing and how much they value it. But would it surprise you to learn that that's not the whole quote, as you may have detected from the suspiciously large space I've left? So the other half of this is that information also wants to be expensive. So this is part of a much larger statement with a completely different meaning. And information doesn't just want to be free, it also wants to be expensive. And the reason it wants to be free, like we said, is because it's cheap to replicate and operate on. But the reason it wants to be expensive is because the right information in the right place at the right time is incredibly valuable. So the analogy I sometimes use for this is that most people don't pay anything to get a stock quote. They expect to be able to go to their favorite search engine, type in their favorite stock ticker, and get a approximately real-time price. People don't want to pay for that. But if you could get prices from 30 minutes in the future, I imagine there's a lot of people who would want to pay for something like that. So that tension between information being free and information being expensive is really important because it plays a large role in whether it's possible for organizations to manage information complexity well. So as they grow, the kinds of organizations, the kind of information that organizations need to store and understand to run their business also gets bigger and more complicated. But if they don't devote a proportional amount of energy to making sure that they can explain how everything fits together, why that information is important, how it's used to solve business problems, then it's really hard, or very quickly gets really hard, to build software systems effectively. So I want to start by talking about some of the reasons that organizations struggle or stumble when managing their information complexity. So here's a just quick demonstration of this problem. If you ask most startups or most mid-sized companies, they know exactly who their customers are, exactly how much they're spending, and exactly how many of them there are, because there just aren't that many of them to look at. So it's easy to see all of them at once. Now, in this 2022 survey, the CIOs of 48 payments companies were asked a similar question. Do they know how to count just one metric about their whole business the number of transactions that they conducted in the last 24 hours. So what percentage of the CIOs responding to that question of a survey do you think we said yes? And by a show of hands, we'll just do this in increments of 25%. So how many of you think it was 0? The answer is closest to 0%. How many of you think it's closest to 25%? 50%? 75%? 100%? Okay, pretty even distribution. I would say there's maybe a hump around 50, and a bunch of you had no faith in the CIOs and said 0. The correct answer is 23%. So when a payments company can't tell you how many payments they did today, we have a problem, right? So it's no wonder that enterprises of all sizes and shapes have issues with information complexity. So what's going on here? So I think the first and most pernicious problem is that it's really hard to see complexity being added because it's often very gradual. So for example, an online storefront might begin life with a very straightforward understanding of the customers they have and the products that they sell. And the information systems and the applications and services that the product and engineering teams build to reflect that understanding are straightforward, well understood, there's a small number of them, and so on. But over time, as new capabilities are added, or new geographic regions get opened up, or any number of ways in which a business can expand, the existing model starts to no longer quite suffice. So new software and data gets created to support a new business goal or a capability that didn't exist before, and new teams spring up to do those things, and new leaders are hired to run the new teams, and eventually somebody gets a 8-figure transformation budget to do something, to say, wait, this is too expensive, this is too complicated, we need to simplify. We might even start to separate the places where the information lives. We might store stuff in ways that seems reasonable at first, but which quickly becomes expensive. So for example, here our online storefront has split out the EU products from the North America products because they recently acquired an EU company where they have a completely different opinion about how products should work. So now any attempt at understanding this company's product, sales, customers, services, et cetera, requires talking to twice as many things as it did before. Now, is that a cost we want to impose on all future downstream use cases forever, indefinitely? So the second problem is that not only has the world of a growing organization gotten more complicated, it's also gotten blurrier. Here's a real example of 2 different customer objects at the same enterprise company on 2 different products. So you can see that the fields in red don't seem like they have that much to do with the customer, like what is RM underscore XM RAS underscore ID. It might be hard to tell at a glance. And the fields in blue seem like they're 2 different opinions about the same set of facts, a person's name. So it's not necessarily obvious how we would reconcile this. If we thought that there was an unnecessary complexity here, we'd first have to understand what the red fields were doing and who used them, and we'd have to understand why the blue fields were split up in one case but not another. So it's going to take effort, time, and careful thought to disentangle this. We assume that people aren't just doing this at random, they're doing it because they have business motivations or someone told them to or whatever. There's some underlying reason here. Now, this also extends to the APIs and the surface area we start creating with those representations. So in this example, we've already got a customer service, so it's easy to just throw a few more things in there when we need to ask other customer-related questions. So pretty soon, we've got a junk drawer that's hard to navigate and hard to declutter. So in this example, we've added some batch update operations to our normal REST customer API. We've added a end-of-month report that we want to run occasionally to the same API. And then the third problem is that sometimes the assumptions in our software go beyond our business and reflect the social or cultural context in which they were made. So here's part of an actual schema I once had to update in a database associated with a Massachusetts county court system. And in 2003, the Massachusetts Supreme Court decided a case called Goodridge versus Department of Public Health, which is the case that first legalized same-sex marriage in the United States. So, there's social and cultural implications about a legal precedent being set. There's also real implications on the technology systems that represented the understanding of what people thought something should be, in this case, how marriage licenses should work. So there's hidden complexity here in the form of baked-in assumptions about how the world worked that turned out not to be true anymore. So more work, more effort, more disentangling required to line these things up. So you might be tempted to think that there's an inevitable scary quagmire that awaits you on the other side of the complexity spectrum. So as your organization grows, is it just inevitable that all this stuff starts sucking and your life becomes hard, you have to do things twice? And like, is that guaranteed to happen? Is that just the cost of doing business? So that is the conclusion that many businesses reach. They'll hide this complexity by sweeping it under a rug, hidden away in systems with scary names like the Enterprise Data Mart or Central Warehouse Nexus, or insert your favorite three-letter acronym here. So I'm here to tell you that the earlier picture is not an inevitability. You can have managed complexity that helps your business, is understandable by teams, and helps you keep growing without making you want to pull your hair out. So these challenges are not easy to overcome, but they are absolutely addressable. So what's the secret sauce to tackling information complexity? Well, might be giving this away, given the title of the talk and the fact that we're at a domain-driven design conference, but one answer is domain-driven design. So the key to success is going to be for us to organize around the domains of interest to our business in specific ways. So that same year that the Goodrich case I mentioned got decided by the Massachusetts Supreme Court, Eric Evans was writing, or was publishing domain-driven design. And to put that in context, Gmail was released the year after, in 2004. So the first Gmail inboxes were open to the public 20 years ago today, almost old enough to drink in America. So at the time of this talk, the DDD book had just celebrated roughly its 20th birthday. So it's been around for a while, and in that time has enjoyed obvious success to the point where it's got its own conference. But one of the central ideas, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is that if we want to be successful using domain-driven design, that is underpinned by having a shared understanding. So if you don't have that shared understanding to underpin what your notion of a domain is, it's going to be hard to successfully write software in it. And the way I think about shared understanding is that basically two sets of people need to agree on one set of things. So one group of people that will do work to deliver or realize some kind of customer value is cooperating with another group of people who decides what kind of customer value is most important to the business. And the titles and roles and names of these people don't matter, but you can probably imagine what they look like in any given organization. So these are different people with different brains, and in order for them to build the right thing, they need to be aligned on what the right thing is. And we want the understanding about the problems being addressed and the ideas that we're talking about to be as close as possible. So this applies no matter what kind of software you're writing. It could be a microservice with an API. It could be a large language model. It could be a mobile app. It could be whatever. Insert your favorite kind of software here. But if we don't agree about what words mean, how can we possibly hope to build the correct piece of software? So we use a domain here to mean the natural divisions of the business to reflect the reality of how it produces value. So if you're wondering, what are the domains in my company? How do I figure that out? Some people think the answer is, let me go hire 5 enterprise architects to spend time talking with business people and figure it out. It's not that complicated. If we understand how the business works, or hopefully there is someone in your business who understands how the business works, but if we understand how it works, we can start from that understanding. So it's usually pretty easy to get a first draft of what a company's important domains are and the associated bounded context, because at least some of them will be important pieces of the business, words that everybody would understand. So one thought exercise you can do if you're in this position is to imagine asking a company's executives to describe their business using natural language, and then to look at the words that show up most frequently. So what words would you commonly see show up if you surveyed, say, 10 McDonald's executives about what their business does, or 10 Netflix executives, or 10 Stripe executives, or 10 Starbucks executives, or Spotify executives, or whatever? So in this example, you might imagine that Netflix executives say words like subscriber and stream a lot, while the McDonald's executives say a different set of words. They say words like menu and store. So these are hints that those are probably very important domains if business stakeholders are using them to describe how the business works. So note that every company has its own understanding and representation of these ideas. They're not global, and then even within the company, they're probably bounded to specific contexts. So Stripe's understanding and definition of what a payment is very different than what McDonald's understanding of what a payment will be. So each of these is important because the companies care about that between the same word in different ways, and then even within a company, different parts of the company might care about the same word in different ways. So say the fraud department of Stripe probably cares about payments in a different way than the people who process those payments. So notice that there was something we didn't do here when we were thinking about our domains. We didn't ask a database, hey, what are the names of your tables and columns and fields so I can decide like how the information should be organized. We didn't ask a data architect to run a query for us. We didn't go pay a trip to the enterprise data warehouse and hit something with BigQuery and write a big SQL statement, right? So a mistake that architects and technology leaders frequently make is to assume that domain-driven design is purely or primarily a technical activity. And I think that really couldn't be further from the truth. It is in part a technical activity, but it's really about constructing that shared understanding, and that's what it is at the core. So the answer is that you can't really construct a shared understanding if you don't develop that understanding in partnership with someone. If you're coming down from the mountain with the stone tablets saying, this is the way our business works, but that understanding was not developed in conjunction with the business, then you don't have a shared understanding. So we need to collaborate with the specific people or persons who are knowledgeable about that, but who also have a stake in that outcome. That's the business domain expert. So that's going to be the first thing that we put in our toolkit. Whenever we're like doing architecture work that feels it's domain-driven design adjacent, there isn't a business person in the room, we're probably making a mistake. We're probably omitting something important or lacking some shared sense of understanding or missing an opportunity to develop that shared understanding. So we need to ensure that those folks are involved from the beginning, and frankly, many of them are only too happy to talk your ear off about the way their business works to technologists because they don't get to talk to technologists that much. And it allows them to more directly influence the end results that they want anyway. So although domain-driven design has a rich library of possible ways to do exploration, some of which you heard today in various talks, depending on which ones you went to, it doesn't have to be a complicated affair with big formal methodologies behind it of like there's only one way to do this thing or use my special symbology of drawing boxes and arrows. Like, it doesn't need to look like that. It can be very straightforward. And you can start by simply having a work session with the business expert or two, a representative from product and architecture or engineering sides of the house, and then pick 2 or 3 interesting things coming down the pipe on the product roadmap and frame them as questions. So for example, suppose we want to build an early warning system for customer churn detection when we have these internal metrics so that we can take some kind of proactive sales action. So if we've got a customer in our SaaS company that's likely to churn, how might we figure out that that's going to happen in advance? What signals or metrics might they emit? So that has real business value if we can figure that out, because if we can stop people from churning, we can save money on customer acquisition and so on. So first, let's see what our business stakeholder thinks about this space. So working with our business expert, we might just tell a few stories together about what they are, like just what happens in the course of their business when we talk about customer churn. How do we know that somebody is churned? What does that look like? What systems are implicated? What ideas are important in that? And then we write that down, and we just, this is not a UML diagram. This is not, must use some specific representation. This is, can you draw a picture that tells a story level of fidelity, right? Not saying that those things that more fidelity isn't useful, just that you don't need to start there necessarily, right? And I find that the business folks, it's very easy to just get your story out there, just start drawing stuff and writing it down quickly is a helpful way to get started. So use a whiteboard, use a digital technology like Miro or Lucid or whatever your favorite thing is, and let your stakeholders drive that conversation. So don't have a technical expert hold the pen if you can help it. Let them be driving that and facilitating that conversation. However, do have your technical experts be on the lookout for what I'll say are 3 kinds of common problems. So the first kind of common problem is logical inconsistencies or contradictions in the model that the business expert is telling you about. So this will often reveal places where stakeholders don't agree about the way the world works. So in this example, we have an architect that's talking with the business expert, and the business expert has said in the past, products are things that we sell, but what about when someone buys something from us that's sold by someone else? How does that work? So if they buy like you think of like when you go to Amazon and you buy the extended warranty for your stuff, that's not sold by Amazon, but sold by a third party. Is that a product? Should we count that? And the business domain expert says, oh, you're right, that is different than a product we sell. Maybe we need a different word to describe that or think about that. So these are almost always, when you see those kinds of contradictions, as a technical expert, you want to be holding the in-flight model in your head as it's being written down. And anytime they say something that seems contradictory to what was said before, that's almost always worth a discussion. It's almost always worth pausing at that moment to explore why they are holding two separate or contradictory ideas. The second kind of thing to watch out for as a technical facilitator is conflated ideas, ideas that are really separate things but have been smushed together into one thing. And sometimes this just happens out of like, I don't want to say intellectual laziness, but just it's very convenient sometimes to use the same word to mean a bunch of things. But building software requires greater precision than that. So we need to disentangle these smushed together things into separate things. So in this example, the architect has noticed that we combined customers who are businesses and customers who are people into the same idea of customer. Is that okay? Is that not okay? Well, what if it turns out that like the customers that are businesses and the customers that are people have really different rules and processes and operations that apply to one but not the other? Then it probably starts making sense to separate them in some way or have some understanding about what makes them different. So here the business expert has agreed that a customer is just a person or a business that has an active account with us. So it's really about this relationship between the person or business and the account, rather than customers are people and businesses at the same time. And then the third kind of thing to watch out for in this technical facilitation is if you see a gap in the model. So if the stakeholder's kind of glossing over something, or they like don't seem to have a word for it, or they say, you know, it's like when, and they try to describe things in terms of the properties that it has rather than what it is. So an example might be if you ask someone to define like what an account is, it's frequently often these like very general or generic terms that trip them up. Where like everybody knows what an account is, but then if you ask them to describe what is an account, they'll say things like, it has a it has these properties or these fields, but not saying what it is, right? So it's like if I told you that a car had 4 wheels and a steering wheel and some doors and an engine, but I'm not telling you what it is, and it's a mode of transportation that lets you get from one place to another and takes fuel. Like it's like that's the sort of revelation that there's a missing idea when they can't name something, but they're referring to it, or they're talking about it in ways that sort of dance around what it actually is. That's a pretty good hint that it's worth, and again, pausing and just saying, what are we talking about here? What is the actual word? And maybe there isn't a word. Maybe this is a new idea for them all together, and then you might invent that word together. So in this example, the architect has noticed that you can get things besides a product by virtue of a subscription. So for example, you might get some bonus usage credits on an existing product, which is not itself a product. That's a different thing. And the business domain expert says, oh, you're right. You know, that subscription does let you get things that aren't products. So we need some word to describe when a subscription gives you something that isn't a product. Maybe that word is entitlement here. So another activity that I find super useful, once you've gotten like some rough draft version of the model, if it looks super simple and low fidelity like that, just what are these basic ideas? How are they related to each other? Can we tell a story with them? I like to then go to overlaying the systems that we can use to provide that information, because this usually immediately reveals if there's complexity in trying to answer these questions or represent these ideas. So for example, maybe we have some APIs, some databases, a data warehouse, a server running under Alice's desk, that sort of thing, right? So once we write that down and we map it to those ideas, if it turns out that we don't have one place to go to think about all of our customers, like in this example, because people can buy stuff without having a subscription or whatever, then we've sort of immediately revealed a problem. Like if we want one understanding of customer, but we have 17 places that we store customers, well, that's a pretty obvious disconnect that we'll have to resolve, right? And so this tells us hints about the enterprise architecture and whether it can support or sustain this particular domain model and how far away we are from that. So this also gives us a hint that the enterprise probably is going to need to invest in some understanding of its domain services around the customer space. So discovering these natural seams of the business along these domains that we've been identifying is really important because it gives us strong signals about how our APIs, our services, and our enterprise architecture should be arranged. So for example, this picture shows a real example of a credit company that has different information about customers. So in this example, 3 different data stores owned by 3 different, completely different parts of the organization feeds the same data warehouse that constructs the overall idea of what a customer is. Now, if each team believes that they're authoritative for customers, that's a problem because it means that none of them are authoritative for customers, right? So that also reveals something about the difference between the enterprise architecture and what we think the right answer is for customers. Now, this kind of work is likely to be very new to your stakeholders. Every time that I've done this with one of our ultimately successful organizations, it's always, I would say maybe 15% of the time maybe 50% of the time they've heard of domain-driven design, and then when you ask them what it is, it's like 5 blind people describing what the elephant looks like, right? They've all touched a different part of it. One person thinks it means bounded context. One person thinks it means Java classes. One person thinks it means a specific kind of diagram, right? It's not necessarily the full picture. And a small number of people are familiar with it, but they're usually not business stakeholders. So because that kind of work is likely to be new to business stakeholders and maybe even to your technical facilitators, maybe even to you, that's okay. This approach is meant to be casual so that you can benefit from the exploration without a high level of domain expertise or past facilitation expertise. The most valuable part is simply setting aside time to think in structured ways with your corresponding stakeholders. So remember to let business experts take the lead on defining that ground truth, while technical experts should map that picture out. We want to avoid, this is another really common mistake, we want to avoid technical words that aren't really part of the business as we're modeling, but that are just a coincidence of software. So if you have words like message queue or database show up in your domain, that's probably wrong. Unless your business is actually about message queues or databases. If you're, Amazon SQS or something, then okay, sure. But if you're, a fruit juice company, message queues probably aren't part of your business, so it would be surprising if words like that appeared in your domain. So this is really common when people talk about ideas that are already represented in some software system. They'll say, oh, the customer or the product or whatever, that's this table in our database, or that comes from this particular technical location, a database, a message queue, a cache, whatever. And so they'll be thinking about it in terms of the technical location that it occupies in their physical architecture rather than what is the business entity that this represents. So that's super important. And then finally, when you're describing that model and coming up with that shared understanding, you want the definitions that you describe to be durable because they've gotten at the essence of what the thing is, rather than the properties or attributes it has. So if you say a car has 4 wheels and a gas pedal and so on, that's what the thing has. So I don't want to know about the fields or the properties or the attributes. I want to know about what the thing is. So describe for me what this is, not what it has or what it's like or what it seems to be, et cetera. And it's usually worth pausing if they struggle to define that to really nail that down, because often at the heart of that getting clarity on that will really sharpen the domain model and make some stuff that seems like it might have been relevant fall completely away. So that brings us to the next 2 items in our toolkit. So first, we should make leading these kinds of explorations standard practice for your enterprise architects or whoever is in charge of doing that facilitation. And when they're working closely with the business, they can generate a positive feedback loop of trust that instills confidence to keep going forward, right? So if the business sees that it's useful, if they see that you're developing that shared understanding, if they see that their own mental model has become clearer about how things work, that's really valuable. And they can use that to become better collaborators with product, engineering, and architecture staff. And then second, treat the discrepancies that you identify as essentially a form of enterprise technical debt. If you think that there should be one place to have customers and you see 47 of them, something is wrong. And so it shouldn't be merely an intellectual curiosity that getting an answer to basic business questions like how many customers do we have is expensive or requires hitting multiple locations. Like, don't build more stuff to answer the complicated question, make it easier to answer the question in the first place. So that's critical to how we cut out that unnecessary complexity before it becomes a problem. So one place where organizations really struggle is arranging teams to actually do this work correctly. And it doesn't help to have an amazing picture of the domain model, but be completely unable to execute on it because your team and organizational structure is completely incompatible with making that work. So how can we get started with that if you're just a person in an organization and you're not like the CIO? How do you try to do this experiment? So that'll depend radically on where we are in the hierarchy and what our level of influence is or can be, but there's a few ways to get started. So on a small team, you might be given really broad latitude to try out lots of different ideas and work on lots of different things, because it's reasonable to make the assumption that you're all headed in the same direction and that you're working towards the same things. In other words, you share common goals with the rest of your team. But in a larger organization, the goals and objectives of the company may differ radically from that of a single team. So understanding who to talk to when you want to run these kinds of experiments and how to align your goals with theirs is key. So people will want to know what the hell you're doing and what they're going to get out of it if you make a proposed experiment, like we should run domain-driven design on this part of our org, or at the start of this new project, or let me go spend 20 billable hours with this particular stakeholder so we can really tighten this up. So how do you get started in a world like that where people are asking for what the outcome is going to be? And I think outcomes is really the key word here, because those outcomes determine how you're going to talk about your value. So in the example here, the firm cares about a really different set of things than individual teams do. So ideally, in a well-functioning enterprise, it should be clearer to teams how their work connects with the objectives of the firm. So for instance, if sales leaders here care about improving cost of goods sold by 12% and integrating systems with a recent acquisition, and your team cares about a completely different set of things, you need to make those things much closer together if you want a domain-driven design experiment to work. So how could we make the cost of goods sold objective connected to domain-driven design? We might say something like, well, the approach we're going to take to explore this new system we plan to build to reduce customer churn really needs to be tight in understanding how we think about customer churn. And right now, our business experts disagree about the right way to do that. If we can get everyone on the same page and have a shared understanding of the right way to do that, we'll be much more likely to hit our COGS goals. So that might be just a hypothetical off-the-cuff way of doing that. So you can imagine doing that in your own specific cases for your own business folks. Now, this requires that you, as individuals, understand that top half. So you need to understand what your business or what your leaders care about beyond your own team so that you can get the flexibility and the wherewithal to run that experiment. So you need to tailor your message appropriately to what those people actually care about. So convincing other people on your team that domain-driven design is valuable for generating alignment with stakeholders is really different than convincing your CTO that domain-driven design is something that everybody should do in the whole organization. It's usually better to start with a small blast radius before expanding to a bigger one. So I think the right place to start is usually a small experiment at the level of your team that owns some domain of interest, or seems like it could own some domain of interest. And ideally, you can pick a domain where bringing greater clarity or a shared understanding of some kind is going to directly create business value. So for example, a common enterprise problem is that there are competing sources of truth, like we saw in the customer example before, and they each have different facts. Would having, say, a more robust definition of a key idea like that make it possible to have fewer such places, and then we could decommission some of them or move them into some single shared location and then save some money? So there's a pretty clear, direct feedback loop there between, because we applied domain-driven design to reduce the complexity of what we needed to think about, we also got to shut off these things that weren't really relevant anymore. We migrated the data in a way that was helpful to us. So when you give a team or teams ownership of a domain, we also generally want to give them ownership of the representation of the data corresponding to that domain, so that the shared understanding through ubiquitous language has a representation that that team also is doing. Now, if those two things are very far apart from each other, that's a problem. If you have teams that are in completely different locations, completely different goals, completely disconnected from each other, they're not the same crew, that's a problem in general. So we want the services that represent and manipulate and operate on domain ideas in some bounded context to also be very close organizationally and logically to the data representations for those ideas. So a common mistake in enterprises is splitting these up so that the team that owns the service is not the same thing or is very far away from the team that owns the representation. So for example, if you operate some API that describes here's what a customer is, but that API is backed by a database that has a schema that you don't control, that's a problem. The representation of the API has nothing to do with the representation of the schema, even though domain-driven design doesn't say, oh, you should have a totally different representation for the thing over here versus the thing over there. It says there should be the same representation. It should be the same idea. Everyone should be aligned about the way we're talking about that stuff. So if a far-removed team without shared understanding is defining what the schema representing a domain idea looks like, that's a problem. And we'll know if we're doing it right because the domain team should be able to service consumers in the form of customer-facing experiences and leverage by other teams. And we'll also know if they're doing it right because that data should be able to get consumed in broad horizontal ways to answer these big questions. So for example, it might wind up in a data warehouse to build analytics dashboards for some marketing or sales team, but if they're getting everything they need, great. If they're coming back to you every 5 seconds and saying, oh, can you add this field, can you add that field, maybe something is off about the representation. So the next item on our list is to acknowledge that domain-driven design doesn't operate the same way at every level. It might not be possible or easy to get the time of a business stakeholder that can support you. And in especially dysfunctional organizations that you might not even have a relationship with the business stakeholder at all or even know who your business stakeholder is. So those are separate problems, but they're prerequisites to doing this well, I think. And if you do have them in mind, then you want to start with convincing them that your outcome and your interests are aligned with theirs. So let's talk about scaling this up now beyond one team. So once you've got one team up and running and delivering business value, we often find that that gives organizations the evidence and the confidence they need to turn the crank another time. And there's a good model for that. Domain teams are essentially like platform teams and platform services, and they should be run in a similar way in most cases. So we want high-value use cases that they build and deliver, and having those use cases be the basis for what drives the team's work. So how do you tell if a use case is a good one for a team to work on? There's 3 big criteria for domain teams. One is that the use case is valuable unto itself, so it directly drives some business value that is of interest. So that's usually because the domain is important. So if you think that like payments is an important part of your domain, or an important part of your business rather, then great. If you think that streaming is an important part of your business, great. If you think that menus is an important part of your business, great. But it should be obvious to the business stakeholders that that's important. If you say, I'm working on the XYZ authorization service, and they have no idea how it has anything to do with the business, that's a little harder to convince people that the domain-driven design is going to add value unto itself in that specific use case. The second property is that we want to see how the domain that we're building or the use cases we're building support other right now existing or immediately in the future use cases with value. So that means we don't want to speculatively build something. We want to like build this API and then assume 6 months from now that people will start using it. Like we want there to be an immediate, obvious need for this. I need to understand how many people are buying my things. I need to know how many products we have, how many sales we made, how many subscriptions we have, et cetera, et cetera. Those are questions that people want answers to right now. That's immediate business value. If it doesn't exist right now, but you can see a very clear path to people wanting that or saying they want it 1 quarter from now, great. But if they say, this seems like a thing I might want eventually, no, that's speculative building. Nobody is actually your customer at that point. And then the third property we want is there's an obvious way to deliver incremental value. If you've got a really complicated domain with lots of bounded contexts and lots of interactions and moving pieces, and the only way for it to deliver value is for the whole thing to be done, maybe that isn't the best place to start. Maybe there's some smaller blast radius that you can target to provide that value. How do you know when you should add another domain team? The answer is when there's an actual use case that they could work on. So a huge mistake is doing that speculative building. So if you say, we're going to spin up a team to do X and build the XYZ API or the ABC service, but nobody actually has said that they want the XYZ API or the ABC service, then you don't have a customer. You just have like some person who thinks that they have a good idea and they want you to build software. But like, where's the actual customer? Who will consume this information, and how will their consumption of that information create a business value of some kind? So you almost never want to build things speculatively, except in the very rare case where you 100% know that something is coming down the pipe and it must exist in time for that to work. So this usually only happens in cases of like regulatory compliance coming up, and if it's some very well-known specific date, or an acquisition occurring where you absolutely need these things to occur, and that customer is going to be yours even though they don't exist right now because the deal hasn't closed yet or whatever. So it's very rare that's true, and it generally isn't true for most enterprises. So that rounds out the last 3 items in our toolbox. So we want domain teams to be able to run like their platform teams or directly as platform teams in many cases. That's usually the right analogy for most enterprises. We want them to target good use cases where they're valuable, high energy, really clear to business stakeholders, should be easy to explain why the thing is valuable. If you have to write pages and pages explaining why it's useful or valuable, it's probably not useful or valuable. If you have to waste that much ink on describing that it's a good idea, it's probably not a good idea. And then finally, we don't want to build speculatively. We want our domain-driven design use cases and the domains that they embody to be realized at the last responsible moment. We want to wait until we actually know it'll be real to serve those customers and to have that domain exist in the first place. So with those 7 items, that completes our toolkit. So to recap, we talked about these different approaches one can use via domain-driven design to build trust and rapport with the business stakeholders. We saw how the business stakeholders working hand in hand with you can build that shared understanding. We saw that shared understanding can be used as the basis to talk about business value that lets you go and actually build something. And then we saw how that business value that lets you go and actually build something turns into a customer's life has become easier. It's more possible to answer these questions. There's fewer places to go to get the same information, et cetera. So if we can make that happen, if we can follow roughly that sequence, and I don't think it's hard to get started. It's a long journey, but I think each step to take is not that complicated. It's really just about, do you feel comfortable having a conversation with your business stakeholders? Can you get them in a room to whiteboard with you? Because that's really the first step. And if you can get them to do that, then you can get them to build anything that's valuable. So my hope is that you'll be able to take that and go and try it in your own environments. And thank you very much for having me. I will now go quickly check to see if there were questions that came in. You can feel free to clap, that's fine too. Cool, okay. So one question from Lily, sorry, I don't know who Lily is. Lily asked, does the Eric Evans book, Domain-Driven Design, offer any facilitation advice specifically about like how to work with business stakeholders? So it doesn't, my recollection is it doesn't have do these things in this beautiful pattern with these business stakeholders. It doesn't recommend specific artifacts, but it does spend, I think, a lot of great advice about the right way to communicate with folks about complicated domains of various kinds. And it explores in great detail, I think the most valuable part of the business exercises that are mentioned in the Domain-Driven Design book is when there are discussions about specific hypothetical scenarios that you might find yourself in. And I outlined 3 or 4 of them in this talk, but there's a huge library of that within the book itself that cover specific scenarios that are likely to come up in your own exploration. So we talked about, for example, conflating ideas. There's a whole bunch of examples of conflating ideas in the book and what it looks like to split those apart. So hopefully that answered your question, Lily. That was the only question I got. Any other questions before we are out of time? Going once, going twice. Sold. All right. Thank you again.
Another short 15-minute break, and then I think everybody is back in this room for the final panel discussion. So hope to see you there.
Thanks, everybody.